Pardon the interruption. I'm Chris Gehrz. Sam, on July 23rd, American Olympian Michael Phelps will swim a shark as part of the Discovery Channel's Shark Week. Any interest in throwing your hat in the ring and joining this race?
Absolutely. I just need to get some goggles, maybe a swim cap, some new trunks, and learn to swim.
I don't think you're ready to outswim a shark.
I don't need to outswim the shark. I just need to outswim Phelps. Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry. Chris, we are back right before Exam 1.
It's coming up.
Right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the exam. We're going to talk about some of the content we've had in the second half of Unit 1. First off, we've been talking about these sort of questions of justice, things like this. Our last discussion post was around this question. Mm-hmm. People tend to love the sort of the MLK Antigone version of justice, kind of looking to divine moral law as sort of the guidepost for justice. So I want to think about, what if we think about the alternate to that, which is, what are the weaknesses of that argument?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I really do appreciate the arguments people made. I'm glad that they tied it to everything from like Philando Castile to same-sex marriage. But I also wanted to push back a lot harder. And the one thing I did say that I'll just repeat here in case people missed is, like, everyone said, like, as a Christian, right, I feel like I'm held to a higher moral law. So what I want to ask you is, in a very increasingly religiously plural society, are you okay when a Muslim says, well, according to the moral law as it's revealed through the Quran and through Islamic tradition, I cannot obey this civil law? Or if a Jewish neighbor did that, or Hindu or Buddhist or Sikh, or, we've got this growing population of people who, if not atheist or agnostic, are at least secularist, right? Don't want religion coming into the public square, or, are spiritual but not religious. Like, is it okay if they make a kind of vaguely philosophical appeal to something that's not even rooted in a theistic tradition? The problem with there are a lot of problems with Antigone's arguments, but at one point she admits, like, these are eternal, but they're unwritten laws, right? And if they're unwritten, how do we settle these disputes? Like, who has the authority to decide? Is it just always okay for citizens to do this?
Right, and I think that actually that comes into a lot of really almost any definition of justice, unless you have a very strict definition, is the question of interpretation. Right. So we say, okay, well, we're going to say God's law or moral law, and let's say we even agree on the scriptures as the source for that. We're going to see this when we get to the Reformation, right. But who gets to? Because the scriptures don't talk about police shootings. The scriptures don't talk about a lot of these issues, so we have to interpret. Yep. And that's an important thing. That's the kind of thing human beings are good at, but we also disagree a lot. So I think that's a huge piece of I think what's difficult about those sort of moral laws. And where I get worried is when we try to kind of make decisions ahead of time and say, this is what it is. We're very, and this is, I think, what Sophocles is getting at, where I wrote in the post, my favorite Sophocles quote is that there's a point beyond where even justice becomes unjust. Yeah. Right? And it's this idea that, like, we can have a very clean sense of this is what it means to be just. But what he's pointing at there, which I think is really cool, because Sophocles is not a Christian, is he's saying, but there's also this idea of grace and mercy that need to weigh into this. Because there's a point where if we're so strict about whether we're looking to moral law, whether we're looking to the good of the community or any of those kind of things, that there's a point where we need to say, but are we becoming unjust by adhering to a particular definition of justice?
Yeah, the final thing I'd say is, like, we cued them to talk about Antigone, but, like, if you're reading the play, like, she's not responding out of some abstract commitment to the eternal law. She's responding out of that sense of obligation to the laws of the gods, but it's also about family honor, which is not a concept that has a lot of currency in 21st century America. And so students, I would say, like, don't imagine yourself as Antigone. Imagine yourself as, like, a Theban onlooker. One of the people in the streets or the chorus. Like, would you still feel as strongly like she's in the right at that point? That requires at least an empathic leap. And so, like, think more about, like, how do you feel about people who do make this claim in our society? Do you tend to agree with them and endorse them, or do you tend to say, that creates disorder? Hopefully you've taken away from that play, like, Sophocles does not necessarily side automatically with Antigone in this play. This really is a debate, and if Creon is too stubborn, right, and Antigone is also pretty stubborn,
right? And that gets to that great, and Aristotle talks about this, like, the great value of the of the Greeks is moderation. When you go to visit the Oracle of Delphi, one of the things it says is know thyself. The second thing it says is everything in moderation, right? And this is a play about two people who are becoming immoderate, and it's leading to the destruction of their lives, their families, their cities. And so it's a plea for moderation in a world where we are being extremists, which is interesting because King uses the language of extremism.
Exactly. And so, students, if you haven't done your course extension post yet, one thing I did put on there was a post about Birmingham Revolution, which is Ed Gilbreth's book about MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, in which Gilbreth says what King is arguing is like moderate incremental change is not acceptable. It actually does need to be radical extreme change. I'm curious what you actually think about that argument if you step beyond some of the other things he's saying. Okay, let's move on. Sam, in addition to doing their first discussion board assignment, students have now got a couple of museums under their belt, and there's always a learning curve. It's a fairly unusual kind of mode of education. Any advice for students? We got some feedback on the first worksheet. What would you say to students?
Well, I want to start by saying I'm actually really proud of some of the feedback that you guys offer, because one of the big messages that I heard was this took a lot more time than I thought, and that can be framed in terms of why are you making us do this thing that's so long? But that's not how you framed it. You guys said it really in terms of the next time I need to make sure I'm giving myself more time to do this. The other thing is to know that going through the museums is not just about completing the museum assignment. Look at all of the vocab. Think about this like a textbook, right? This is where you're getting a lot of the stuff you're going to need to know. We'll talk about the exam in a moment, but a lot of things that are going to prepare you for the exam. A lot of the content is going to be delivered through these museums. So make sure you're looking at what is the vocab that we have for this unit, and look for those places when it pops up. Take the time to sit and take notes, to write stuff down there, because to do well on this exam, you're going to want to have really good notes you can draw from. So I think that's one of the things is take your time. Think about approaching the museum in the same way you might approach an actual museum, which is when I go to a museum, I don't just start at the beginning and walk through it. What I often will do is let's walk around the museum, see what's there, and then let's start to dive in. Yep. So I can get the lay of the land.
That was what my students said she was going to do different with the second. So after the first museum, she said, I'm going to walk through the whole thing, just kind of browse around, get oriented, and then I'm going to dive into the places where I know I need to dig deeper. And I think what you said about not just viewing this as filling out worksheets is really important. I saw this show up on a response recently where a student actually not only referred to the readings and the film, but actually made a really nice connection to something from the museum that they had just visited. And if you can do that on an essay on the test, that's fantastic. I think we're all really, because otherwise, I told the student in the feedback, one of the traps of the course is you view these as all disconnected assignments, and that's where students tend to start to see this just a pile of information that's dispensable. If you can start looking for connections of how, okay, I need to kind of file that away for later because it ties to this big question that might be an essay, that's where not only you'll do better on the test, but I think you'll also get more out of the course and see why there's this big narrative.
Right, and if we're doing this right, you will feel a flow from, I watched this film, now I'm going to this museum, which is moving from what that last film talked about into these other worlds and pointing us towards what the next film's going to be. So that really is the way that this is. There's some intentionality built into that, and I hope you're starting to experience that as you go through.
We kind of know what we're doing.
We hope. Yeah. So one of the rooms that I think is really interesting in the early church museum is the Christianity Beyond the West. Yeah, this is often a room that students will point to say that was really, really an interesting one, because it's something that students don't often think about. They think about Christianity as a Western thing that gets spread much later through colonialism, imperialism, things like that. But that room is pointing to saying, well, there's actually some much earlier connections where Christianity is non-Western.
Yeah, and I think it emerged most basically from a discomfort I think we all have, which is this is a Western Civ course, but it's also about Christianity. And because we've joined those two, it does create this false impression that we think Christianity is just a Western religion. And so, we have to wrestle with that, because that is the mandate of our curriculum, is that's where we start, and then you go other places. So I'm really glad this museum points to some stories of Christianity that stay in Africa and in Asia, right? As we move to Europe, understand, especially Ethiopia, there's this ancient church that is really interesting and complicated. It has even a different scripture, but in the Middle Ages, you've got Ethiopian kings who are incredibly violently devout, right? and the missionaries that are going out as far as China, right, in the 7th century. It's just a fascinating story, and so we want to at least have that there as a reminder that our story is going to move towards Europe, but that's not the only story of Christianity. But the second reason I like it is to remind you, like, CWC is not this, like, standalone thing where you complete it and you'll never have to think about these things again. This is a way of pointing you, I mean, like, there are some paths that you will have a chance to explore, either in Gen Ed or in your major, or maybe you just take an elective. So, like, if that was really interesting,
or this thing called life,
or you can get a book, right? Like, if that was a really interesting room to you, like, there are courses you can take in our Biblical and Theological Studies department, in history, in philosophy, where you can further explore those histories. And so, don't feel like this has to be, well, that was a nice room now. Like, if you found those interesting, you kind of flag that away as you're registering for courses maybe in October. Here's something I want to do in J-term or in the spring. Sam, we've mentioned a couple times. Let's finally come to it. The first exam is coming up right after Independence Day. So we talked a little bit about this on the last webisode. We talked about essays. We talked about the mastery vocab. Any final pre-exam advice that you want to offer?
I have three pieces of advice. First is, before you click the button to start that exam, have all your ducks in a row. Have your notes, because it's gonna be really hard to look everything. Although, because open book, open note, that stuff's tempting to say, like, well, I'll just go take it because I can look stuff up. That's a trap.
Yeah.
So we're telling you that's a trap if you don't have your things prepared. So when you're going through those museums, this is why you took notes. Is now it's easier to reference those things, to find those things. So make sure you've got everything ready to go there. A second thing is, when you're, and I noticed this by looking at the first couple of museums, I try to, for my students, I often tend to write a lot when I'm grading, especially early on in the course, because I want to really push you when you're writing significances, and on the exam, you're going to have those connection questions that you guys talked about in the last webisode, is don't make a lot of assumptions about, like, oh, if I mention this, that of course implies all of this other information. Write it.
Yep.
When you're talking about significances, really think about, like, we're thinking about why something's important. Think about, there's really three questions I think that help with that. Why was this person, event, thing important in its own time period? Why is it important to us today? And how does it connect to this sort of notion of Christianity and Western culture? And you know, when you're doing connection questions, you start with, why are each of these things individually significant? So that's a good way to start with that. And, you know, don't be afraid to write a little more. And that would just be from reading, at least the students that I've graded, like, they're good answers, but I really want to push you to say, tell me more why it matters.
I think that's true. I also do want to caution, like, a common pitfall in the first test is people then spend like half an hour writing a connection.
Right.
Like that, I mean, that's an important section. You need to make clear that you understand, but there are concise ways of doing that too. Like, make sure you also have a sense of how long that essay is going to take.
Yep, absolutely. And then the other thing, it ties into thinking about the essay, which is, and you guys have done actually a pretty good job of this in the writing responses that you've done to the films, is when you're explaining something, explaining an idea, especially explaining a person, if it's somebody that we had a reading from, try to really use specifics from their reading. Try to talk about them in their own words. Grab a quote, put it in there and say, okay, well, Plato said this, and then explain what that quote is. It's not enough to just drop the quote in. Use that as a way to talk about it. That's what a good specific detail looks like. So you could quote a reading. You could quote something that was brought up in the film. So we have lots of experts in the film, lots of profs talking. So you could say, you know, Sarah Shady talked about this in the film, or in the museums. There's lots of details in there. So I'm looking, when I'm grading those essays, I'm looking for specific details to say, okay, here's where I'm getting this information. This isn't just you reflecting on, here's what I think about this. There really is, I want you to be pulling details as well.
Yeah, that's the easiest separator I think we have. I mean, past just finishing the assignment, making sure you understand what the question is and why it matters. Like, as we're thinking about the difference between, you know, an answer and a really good answer, like, that's a very easy thing for us to see. And it really, I mean, I think people who do well in that are doing well in other parts of the test too. So as you're studying for the vocab, as you're studying for, like, where the map is, and especially the timeline, like, I mean, like, people who really take that seriously, I think those connections start to snap for you, and you see how you could use them.
Yeah, I would say the difference between a sort of high C, low B answer and a high B, A answer is the difference between a correct answer and a complete answer. I mean, that's what you want to be looking at. Chris, Independence Day is right. We're right on the doorstep of it. Yes. So when we think about the 4th of July, I mean, we're all Americans. The three of us teaching this course, we're all American Christians. What advice do you think Augustine would have for American Christians as we approach this holiday, which really celebrates America?
Yeah, I mean, I always feel like City of God is pretty significant in terms of helping us think through this both-and relation. I mean, in some ways, it starts with Letter to Diognetus. You all wrote a reading response about how we're both citizens. We like every land is our fatherland and no land is our fatherland, right? Like, I mean, he's pushing back against the idea that what happens in this earth doesn't matter. You know, it's like it doesn't belong to God anymore. What we do here has no bearing on anything. Like, I mean, in some respects, the relationships we form here and the allegiances and the loves we have here are really important. And so Augustine would tell us, like, if you should love your country at some level, right? And probably more importantly, you should love the people of the country, your neighbors. I mean, I think one trap of nationalism is that the nation is an imagined community. You don't meet, there are 300 million Americans. Even with Facebook, you're hardly connected to any of them. And yet you have this sense of, I'm part of this community. I owe something, maybe even my life to it. Like, that becomes dangerous. But in the sense of you actually do love people, like, I think that's okay. Like, that is an expression of neighbor love. As long as it's not exclusive, as long as it then doesn't make you fail to love your neighbors beyond this country, right? And especially as long as it doesn't get in the way of what Augustine would say is your highest love, which is your love of God, right? And I think there is a danger here. So there was a story that was going around the internet last week about a church in Dallas led by a pastor named, I think it's Robert Gehrz, who fairly politically active. He was an early kind of endorser of Donald Trump, and they actually did a Freedom Sunday service where they put fireworks in the sanctuary. All they sang were patriotic songs. There was no mention of Jesus whatsoever. And I think Augustine would recoil from that and say, like, oh, this is like Roman paganism, right? This is like the cult of the emperor. We have taken our need for the divine, but we have just taken the love of country and substituted that for love of God. And so that becomes the danger. So I guess, like, there's something valuable about these holidays, which are holy days set apart because they remind us you belong to a community. You know, I think also, like, we spend time with families, and that's a good love to cultivate. As long as you recognize there's going to be a temptation to raise up an idol called the United States of America, right? And that's not the same thing as God. And so, it's complicated, right?
Right, and I think acknowledging that it's complicated, and then I think saying, you know, even if, let's say, today, right now, I can articulate to myself, like, here's how I think about that relationship. Part of what I think Augustine would push us towards is to push us to say, keep interrogating that definition. Mm-hmm. So, like, come up with ways of thinking about it, but always hold that definition loosely enough to say, well, I'm going to need to constantly there isn't an answer to it. Mm-hmm. There isn't a clean answer to say, this is how you do it. So instead, this is a question you keep asking. And that's actually where we want to be, not once we find the answer, then it can just be concrete and we can say, that is the answer to this. You know, I think that's that's how I tend to think about that. And I think that sort of fits the fact that Augustine is one of those people who wants to that's what engaging culture looks like, is you can't have too many of those concrete definitions.
Okay. That's it for segment 1. We'll be right back, and I have a feeling Augustine will make an appearance in segment 2 as well. All right, welcome to segment 2 of our pre-Unit 1 exam webisode. Because, Amy, it is the webisode before the exam, we thought we'd do a good review activity. So this is the second game we tend to do a lot on the webisode.
And this one does really help with
I think it's actually really good. Like, it's one of my favorite things we do. Yep. So this is called Food Chain. So what we're going to do is go through all of the mastery terms from Unit 1, and we each have created a list of the 5 most significant. So this could be ancient world, early Christianity, all of one, all of that, with probably a mix. And we'll kind of alternate, so we'll start with number 5, work our way up, kind of critique each other's suggestions, and then you all will get to weigh in with, again, who you thought is the winner. Now, Amy, I understand you might have won the first leg of our competition.
Is that what you've heard?
Yeah.
Oh.
So I feel a little intimidated, but we're going to give it a shot. I should confess, you know how you got a song stuck in your head sometimes? Yeah. Right, and the song stuck in my head today is Bibbidi Bop. Is it from Mary Poppins?
No, it's from Cinderella.
Cinderella.
Oh my gosh.
See, so, like, I don't know what that means exactly, but I just feel like my mental acuity is maybe not at its peak, so just go easy on me.
It's Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo.
Bibbidi Bop. It's okay. So,
it's not a hip hop song, Chris.
So, like, set the bar low for my performance on this. Okay, you want to start or shall I start?
You go right ahead. Please
okay.
Do.
So I'm going to start with someone we hardly ever talk about because his significance is not obvious right now, but after Unit 2 it will be.
And say ba-bam when you put it up.
No. So this is Jerome. So we did talk a little bit about monasticism at the end of Unit 1, and Jerome is a famous monastic who ends up living actually in Bethlehem. He's most famous not for being a monk, though, but for translating the Old and New Testaments from Hebrew and Greek into the vulgar Latin, the common Latin of his time. This then becomes the Bible of the Middle Ages, and really the Bible of the Catholic Church for much longer after it. And so I just wanted to put him up as a signal of the importance of Scripture in this kind of world that we're building. That, I mean, the Middle Ages will come to the kind of the tricky place of the Bible, and we'll get to this with the Reformation, but this text really shapes Western civilization in powerful ways, and it's his translation that does that for a good, 1,200 years or so. So I think it's easy to overlook why Jerome is significant, but I wanted to at least pay attention to the importance of the Bible.
Good choice. On the theme of important texts and their significance in history, here I am going to put Homer. So we have our ancient Greek poet. I actually did choose this because I knew. I thought to myself, what would Professor Mulberry choose? And he would choose Homer.
Can I do number 4? Because you just stole my thunder.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You
Were you also going to choose
I was
it?
going to
Because
stand in for Professor
So,
Mulberry.
students, just an exam tip. Timeline, Homer, he's the earliest person. So you can usually sort of use Homer to help sort of orient yourself. But the significance of the Iliad and the Odyssey, both in terms of literature, what it tells us about ancient Greek culture, the way that it influences ancient Greek culture, the way that Homer connects to other terms, understanding Hellenistic culture really more broadly, the structure of the society, what values the society has, virtue, honor, trust, thinking of yourself as sort of part of the greater whole, less individual focus, more communal focus. So who's read the Iliad or the Odyssey? Raise your hands. Oh, look at that. Okay.
One more
right, yeah,
there.
one more in here, and I see a whole bunch of hands out there at home. So
By the way, write in for your tickets to be in the studio audience for this.
yes, please. It's a prestigious place, and that we only give out the tickets come once a year.
Okay.
Ed Sheeran, who wants to go to that? You can come and sit at this. All right, so do you want to say more?
Well, yeah, no, I think you put it very well. I mean, kind of by the same token of Jerome, the importance of a text. I think I'll put this on the extension board at some point, but what is the canon of Christianity and Western civilization? In many ways, the Iliad and the Odyssey are the canon long before Scripture is added to it. And it also points to the role of education. These are educational texts for long times, and they connote, here's what virtue looks like. And so again, it's I think we want to put it at least lower on the list because it's an easy thing to overlook. It's not a reading we necessarily tie an assignment to, but it is very significant as we think about how Christianity is emerging from this Hellenistic context. Okay, so I'll just go straight through number 4.
Okay, all right.
Covered mine.
So then coming in at number 4, who would I be if I didn't continue to make my winning argument from last week, which is Alexander the Great. So again, these two terms do have a connection that Alexander is spreading not only he's not only creating a military empire and a strong military conquest, but he is spreading a culture as he goes as well that influences every single level of the society and the way that the society looks, the way that the society functions. Alexander the Great, again, I do think in some respects unrivaled in history when we tend to think of, number one, think about the historical context of the time and what Alexander achieves, but also the significance of sort of this, what made him what he was. And again, that's a tie to Homer here, that Alexander's father gets him the very best tutors, and if you can remember, if you've been studying, you know who one of his most famous tutors was, and the fact that and again, I'm not acting like Alexander the Great was this great spreader of peace and this humanitarian by any means, but it's just an interesting example of how these influences from the culture, education, the values of a culture then actually manifest in the spreading of an empire.
Sure. It was a winning argument for Sam, of course. I'll just say he's a taste maker, not an idea.
Oh, did you win that?
No, I don't think
Oh,
so.
okay.
I'm
all
just
right.
kidding. So I'm not going to dwell on that. I'll go to my number 3.
Yeah.
So I'm always tempted to put Augustine very high here because we say, he's the most important Christian theologian since
But you're
the
going to put him
Apostle
in the
Paul. Who's more important? Well, Paul, actually.
Yes,
would be more important
that's a good, yeah.
So again, I feel like this is someone that is significant on one level. We all know how significant, but we don't actually lavish that much attention on him until you kind of step back and see connection. So number one, I was just struck looking at the first half of the Early Christianity Museum again, how important the connections between Judaism and early Christianity are, and here is our bridge figure between those two, for better and for worse. But second, he's the first evangelist, but he is the first theologian, right? He's the first one reflecting on the teachings of Christ and giving us some of these categories we then debate for the rest of the course. So in some ways, like we'll say at one point, like the Reformation is a debate between Augustine's view of the church and Augustine's view of sin. I mean, it's really a debate about the nature of Paul in certain ways.
And such an interesting. Okay, so. Yes, but also again, I think this. Okay, in contrast to Alexander. Yeah, thank you. Could you fix that? I want to note that your spatial relations were way off right here, but. Paul also, I think, is this example of really speaking to the culture, and that is such a model for us today in terms of understanding how do you make, I don't want to say the gospel applicable, because I think the gospel is always applicable, but making the gospel accessible, rather, and speaking to different audiences. So we know when Paul is speaking to audiences that would have no kind of knowledge of Jewish culture and history or any kind of familiarity with Jewish scriptures. Then we have scripture that we see where Paul is speaking directly to people who would have a sense of Jewish history or Jewish heritage, at least. And I think that is something that is so valuable. Also, what it also tells us about the historical context of the Roman Empire, the notion that during this period of the Pax Romana, this Roman peace, that it's created a world where it's resulted in more openness of travel, openness of ideas. In some respects, we actually could say tolerance. I mean, Christianity will eventually sort of become a threat, but not necessarily at this point. And so it's those other sort of geopolitical factors that also contribute to Paul's success as, I think, probably history's greatest missionary.
Yeah, our church was doing an exercise this past spring called the Community Bible Experience, where you read through the New Testament in whole books, but it's in chronological order. It was really fascinating just to read through Paul's letters again, just see him wrestling with, like, how do you do life together? I mean, like, he's also the first one to deal with what does it mean to be the church, and how do we live in relation to others,
and like, right? Confronting issues. I think it's interesting how you can read Paul, and you can tell when Paul gets frustrated. So if you read some of the letters to the Philippians, or if I think of like 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Paul's kind of like, get your act together, figure this out, people. I also listened to Paul Simon on the way to in here this morning.
Interesting last bid for the win. Okay, I'll go back to ancient
Greece.
I'll go back to ancient Greece for number 2. Now, this is tough, right? Like, we've got Socrates, we've got Plato, we've got Aristotle. In some sense, all 3 belong up here, but we want to make the case for others. So I'm going to make the move where I'll say I want one to stand for all 3. And if I have to pick one, I'm going to pick Plato, because, we don't know Socrates without Plato. And in some ways, like, you can't have the significance of Aristotle, except that he is responding to Plato. Third, I tend to really side with the argument that he is the more significant figure. And in some ways, I think, especially for Christians wrestling with, because, they'll have to respond to Aristotle's notions of epistemology and virtue ethics too, but he's such an important figure for a people who believe that in some respects this world is not our home.
Yeah,
like, what does it mean that our citizenship is in heaven? He's giving us categories to help think about
and gives some language to the moments where you realize you're not, right? Even though Plato never says, we're aliens passing through, or at the same time, so much of Plato's writing actually brings comfort to the idea of, like, we are sort of aliens, and by alien I don't mean.
Well, and that by itself, I think also he's one of the first then to force us to think about what do we do with people who are around, before Christ, have no connection to Judaism, and yet in some ways are seeking after truth, right? I think that's
are these fingerprints,
right? And I think that's really important to our day. Like, what do we make of truth emerging from beyond Christianity, truth coming from the wider culture? And in some ways, we should really be careful with Plato, but we also, there's wisdom there. And so that he early introduced this ongoing challenge for us in CWC.
Oh, well, no argument here.
Oh, my goodness. This is the worst food shade ever.
But that just tells you how much we love this content and how we just...
Do we have a tie option?
We can maybe do food chain and talk about favorite desserts, and you'll put rice pudding way up here, and that won't even be on my list. But anyway, no, you've just kind of said it all. But again, I think of Plato. We can argue the importance of Socrates. We can argue the importance of Aristotle. Who's holding their hands? Plato is holding their hands. Plato. We don't have one without the other. So Plato is like he is the meat in the sandwich.
Okay, how about you do your top one?
Okay, all right. Well, I know. What do you want me to do? Am I supposed to?
No, it's okay because we disagree.
Who do you want me to?
No. This is good. We actually have something to debate for once.
That's exciting. I picked this for you because I thought that if I didn't have this, you would just like pin me to the mat with Augustine, if you will. So, Augustine, who we encounter here at the end of Unit 1, and then we will pick up with as we journey into Unit 2, stands to me as, We call him one of the greatest Christian writers, one of the most prolific writers, meaning the amount of writing that he did. But really this example of a conversion story, the notion of being quite comfortable with the culture around him and feeling and kind of having the pleasures of the world in many respects, and extremely intelligent, and yet at the same time has this inner wrestling, and is very honest about that inner wrestling. And so I think it's not just Augustine's writings, but it's really, again, looking at the historical context of how his life and his work at different points match up with what he was dealing with personally. But also Augustine, for me, significant because really diving into this question of, I don't know, what does Christianity really do when it's in crisis? Because where Augustine winds up in terms of the fall of the Roman Empire, and it's a challenge to your framework. If your framework is sort of that, well, I do good things, I pray, I read scripture, everything works out okay in my life, and you're living in this broader Christian culture, and then it all falls apart, and not only that, but it falls apart at the hands of people that you view as being inferior, intellectually inferior in terms of their military might, but then also very much inferior from a religious perspective. These are pagans. These are people who are less than people, less than humans, these Germanic tribes. And so Augustine wrestles with this question and sort of what does your framework mean when all of a sudden somebody has, poked holes is way too gentle of a phrase, literally has burned it down. So still extremely relevant. And I like that, like the notion of wrestling. I think sometimes, I don't know, students, what your experience is, but I know sometimes I think we don't wrestle with doubt very well, or we don't make space to wrestle with doubt. And I feel like, well, if there's anybody who wrestled with doubt and was able to work through it, and yet at the same time make a sort of peace with it, it's Augustine. So.
Yeah, I've already talked about Augustine in this webisode. I clearly think he's significant. Yes. Kind of reversing the logic of Plato. Like Augustine
think he's significant.
Augustine is also the first Christian theologian who's really a serious figure in like wider philosophical sort. Any philosopher needs to wrestle with Augustine's view of human nature, the nature of truth, of citizenship. We've talked about patriotism, nationalism already. So in that sense, like he is really he is the cornerstone of the Christian intellectual tradition, even more than.
And yet, outside of that Christian tradition too, in that Augustine stands as this figure that, regardless of one's belief in God or religion, Augustine's intellect and his theories can't be ignored, right?
Right.
What do you have there?
Well, so I could easily put Augustine. Constantine. And this, I feel like in some respects, like the past is worthy of study by itself, but the past is also worthy of study because it helps us understand our present. And like in our present moment, I think this is a super important figure, right? It's the great twist in the story, right? We've already presented this way, but could you have imagined, in the year 300, we'll go like right up to the brink of the Great Persecution, that by 325, a Roman emperor would be calling a council to settle a debate over the nature of who Jesus is, right? And that instead of being persecuted, Christians would be rising up in the empire. And it just, in some ways, for me, if this course is about Christianity and Western culture, this is the hinge, right? This frames the biggest questions, not necessarily in the philosophical, theological world, but in terms of how do we live in the world? Because you've got a very clear choice here. And we see this in our own politics right now. Like, is the best thing for the church to make strategic alliances with powerful political figures who have legal authority and military backing? Is that the best way to protect and advance the mission of the church? Or in some ways, does that entirely betray the mission of the church, which we'll hear like once we get back to the Anabaptists at the end of Unit 2. So I just feel like in so many ways, like if all of like Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato, or if all of like the Reformation is a footnote to Augustine, like all of our subsequent debates about how Christians live in Western culture, and especially with politics and the law, is a footnote to not anything he writes, but to his life and to his impact on the church.
Yeah, okay. I like that choice. The only critique I would have of that choice is that I don't think that, with what you just said, which I agree with, the influence in terms of, for Christians in Western culture, figuring out what our relationship is with power, authority, the government, Constantine isn't really a figure that translates across Western culture in terms of what meaning does Constantine have for Christians who are living in, whose Christian history for thousands of years has been rooted in Latin America or has been rooted in Africa. So I'm just
I think that, I'm going to push back there because I think they do, because for those Christians, they're responding to Constantinian Christianity, right? They're responding to empires that seize the mantle I mean, if you're a Latin American Christian, you're responding to an American empire that calls itself Judeo-Christian. Right?
Yes, no, that's true.
So I think it's really important.
No. I'm just saying, I think that, say, Augustine would have a greater reach in terms of
we can finally
influence.
agree to disagree. So there you go. You have at least one thing to separate it. So cast your vote on Moodle. Who won Food Chain? Amy or me? You really can't go wrong.
You can't.
But you should vote for me. All right, we'll be right back.
Again, I don't say things like that. I let my work stand for itself.
Welcome back. It's happy time. Amy, what do you have for me?
Well, okay. First of all, happy birthday to Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise of The Mummy?
Tom Cruise of The Mummy. Quiz time. Sam, which birthday do you think this is for Mr. Cruise?
Well, The Mummy's Rotten Tomato score, I was just looking at this, is 19, I believe. So,
so
I think he's older than 19.
A little bit.
I'm going to say he's going to be north of 3 times 19, which would be north of sorry. I'm going to say, I'm guessing it's a round number. I'm going to say 60.
Oh, that's pretty close. Tom would be crying right now. He's only 55.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Which to me, but I don't know, or the person we think Tom Cruise is 55.
Right.
I'm pretty sure it's like a clone that he's created.
Exactly.
That goes around.
I was just listening to someone talk about a Tom Cruise theory where, like, they thought that Tom Cruise, Risky Business was one of Tom Cruise's really early movies, that at some point right after that movie, like, that Tom Cruise like disappeared and there was a replacement. So like we're dealing with that clone that just keeps getting rebooted.
Yep.
So.
Nope. So anyway.
All right, Amy, happy anniversary. Are you a Harry Potter fan?
Yes.
All right.
Totally.
I've read a couple of the books, so that's kind of where I'm at.
Is that true? You've only read a few of the books?
Yeah.
Oh.
I've seen all the movies and stayed awake during most of them.
No, I love Harry Potter. I've read all of the books, and I want to point out I was reading Harry Potter before Harry Potter was a thing.
Wow,
it's
all right.
True. 1999. Okay.
All right, so Harry Potter turned 20 last week.
Yes.
All right, fess up, Amy. Did you take the Hogwarts house sorting quiz?
I did.
So did I. Where did you end up?
Hufflepuff. Are we surprised?
Ravenclaw.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So are you surprised that Chris got 80% Ravenclaw?
No, not really.
I don't know if he was hoping that we were going to be surprised by that.
Some of us are more concerned with being nice.
That's right. Some of us are nerds, as it turns out.
Indeed. If Hogwarts was burning down, would you A, stay in your room and study? Ding, ding, ding. B, save your friends, right? C, I started the fire. Anyway, all right. Okay, this is kind of sad. Let's just kind of bring it down a notch. Happy trails, a sad goodbye, Unit 1. We'll see you later. Be honest, Sam, where does this first unit rank out of the 3? Where is this on your... Because we like to rank everything.
That's right. Well, it's hard because I know... I've been part of this course for way too long in my life. Like, I know for students who love the course... So I'm talking about my TAs. For students who love the course... Unit 1 is the one they love. They love because they love the ancient philosophers. They love the early church.
Yeah.
But I feel weird saying to you, we just did the best part, and
it's
going to go downhill.
It's all kind of downhill.
For me, I actually really love Unit 2. There's a lot of stuff that I find exciting in Unit 2. But Unit 3, you get more of the Reformation.
Yes.
And
Return of the Jedi.
The modern age.
Unit 3 is.
Yeah. And it sort of ends on like some dark questions.
Yeah.
So, where does it rank? This is like trying to like rank my children. My daughter is my favorite.
I was going to say
that's right.
It's not difficult.
And I said that on my son's 12th birthday. I just said my daughter's my favorite. That's Bank. You're never going to see this, but if so, this is just for show.
Right.
I think it might be my favorite.
Is it really?
I love even as a little kid, I loved ancient Greece and ancient Rome.
The Hogwarts is burning down.
That's right.
There you are, studying in your dorm.
As you saw in segment 2, like both of you pointed to Homer and said this was for me. Like Homer's my guy.
Homer's your guy.
Yeah. So I mean, it probably really is my favorite. I end up lecturing a lot in the face-based course in Unit 1. That's where a lot of my time goes. Yeah.
I know you're not a pet person, but if you were, you could name your pet Homer.
I kind of like that.
I kind of do too.
Yeah.
Like a little gerbil Homer.
No, not a rodent.
Oh, true. Okay,
Yeah.
A snake?
Although they eat rodents, so we team up that way. That's a little Slytherin for me, though.
Yes, all right. Well, that's true.
All right.
Anyway.
Well, students, this is the end of the show. We've reached the end of the road for Unit 1. Your exam is coming up. Amy, any last advice for the exam?
Just Be calm, be cool. You're going to think to yourself, you really can't do it in this much time. Yes, you can. You will.
Others have done it before.
Others have done it before. It's only killed a few. We usually give them their money back. But I just want to remind you, it really does sort of take one to just then get the hang of it, but not to be. That doesn't mean you're gonna bomb it. It just means that you will feel so much better after you have the first one out of the way. Not because it's so difficult, but rather just because you'll have a sense of what it looks like, how much time it takes you, whatever.
Make sure you vote for.
Be cool, people. Be cool. Be chill.
Right. Make sure you vote for who had the best food
Yes.
chain.
Mm-hmm.
I know they were pretty similar.
They were, and again,
but there are subtle differences there.
You vote on the content and what you felt was
and with
best.
your heart, right?
And with your heart.
All right.
That's right.
Well, good luck on the test. We will see you in Unit 2.